For decades, cigarette addiction was publicly framed as a matter of choice. Smokers were told they lacked willpower. Governments blamed personal responsibility. Tobacco companies insisted nicotine was merely a flavor component, no more addictive than caffeine. Behind closed doors, the truth was already settled. By the early 1960s, internal research conducted by the largest tobacco corporations had reached a unanimous conclusion. Nicotine was not incidental, it was the product. And addiction was not an accident, it was a design requirement. Confidential laboratory reports circulated among executives at Philip Morris. R.J. Reynolds, Brown and Williamson and L'Oreal confirmed that nicotine altered brain chemistry in ways strikingly similar to heroin and cocaine. Dopamine spikes, dependency loops, withdrawal symptoms, cravings that intensified under stress. These findings never reached the public. Instead, tobacco scientists were instructed to reframe nicotine as a behavioral reinforcer, language chosen carefully to avoid legal definitions of addiction. Lawyers reviewed research papers before publication. Entire studies were buried. Others were rewritten to obscure conclusions. While executives testified under oath that nicotine was not addictive, their own files described it as essential to sustained consumption. The industry understood something else even more dangerous. Nicotine alone was not enough. Early cigarettes delivered inconsistent doses. Some smokers failed to inhale deeply. Others did not absorb enough nicotine to remain dependent. That variability represented lost customers, and so the engineering began. Chemists discovered that manipulating the pH of cigarette smoke could dramatically increase nicotine absorption in the lungs. By adding ammonia compounds, manufacturers could freebase nicotine, converting it into a form that crossed the blood-brain barrier faster. The effect was immediate and powerful. Smokers felt a sharper hit, a faster reward, a deeper dependency, often without realizing why newer cigarettes felt harder to quit than older ones. Internal Philip Morris documents later admitted that ammonia technology significantly enhances nicotine delivery. R.J. Reynolds described it as a key design feature. Publicly, neither company mentioned it. At the same time, tobacco firms began altering the physical structure of cigarettes themselves. Filters were redesigned with microscopic ventilation holes that diluted smoke during machine testing, lowering reported tar and nicotine levels, while collapsing when a human smoker inhaled, delivering full-strength smoke. So-called light cigarettes were born, marketed as safer, designed to deceive. Internal tests confirmed that smokers compensated by inhaling deeper, taking more puffs, and blocking ventilation holes with their fingers. The result was often higher nicotine intake than with regular cigarettes. The illusion of safety kept smokers addicted longer. The illusion of choice kept regulators at bay. By the 1970s, tobacco companies were no longer merely growing and selling tobacco. They were running advanced behavioral laboratories. Rats and monkeys were trained to self-administer nicotine through intravenous lines. Brain scans mapped addiction pathways. Genetic research explored susceptibility in adolescence. Youth became a priority. Internal marketing documents described teenagers as replacement smokers. Another memo warned that if young people did not start smoking, the industry had no future. Candy-like flavorings were tested. Smoothness was optimized. Harshness was reduced, not to protect health, but to ease initiation. Publicly, executives denied targeting minors. Privately, product design was calibrated to make first cigarettes easier to tolerate, while ensuring long-term dependence once habits formed. The contradiction was deliberate. As lawsuits mounted in the 1980s and 1990s, tobacco companies intensified secrecy. Research divisions were renamed. Studies were outsourced to foreign subsidiaries. Sensitive documents were labeled privileged to shield them from discovery. Yet the paper trail grew too large to erase. Whistleblowers began to emerge, scientists and executives who had seen the truth from the inside. Millions of internal documents leaked during state lawsuits against Big Tobacco. They revealed a coordinated, decades-long effort to engineer addiction while publicly denying its existence. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was written in the industry's own words. And it pointed to a conclusion that could no longer be avoided. Cigarette addiction was not a side effect. It was the business model. By the early 1990s, the tobacco industry's internal secrecy began to fracture. What had once been isolated leaks turned into an avalanche of evidence. Lawsuits filed by U.S. states seeking to recover healthcare costs forced tobacco companies into a position they had avoided for decades: disclosure. Under court order, millions of internal documents were released. Memos, lab reports, marketing plans, chemical analyses, and executive correspondence were suddenly visible to the public. Together, they formed a detailed record of intentional addiction engineering. One document from Brown and Williamson described nicotine as a drug with pharmacological effects indistinguishable from other controlled substances. Another stated plainly that nicotine is addictive and that the company's survival depended on maintaining the delivery of nicotine at a level sufficient to sustain addiction. These were not rogue opinions. They were institutional conclusions. Philip Morris research files revealed decades of work optimizing nicotine impact, the speed at which nicotine reached the brain, because faster delivery increased dependency. Internal models showed that even small delays reduced addiction strength. Cigarettes were redesigned accordingly. Filters, paper porosity, burn rate, and tobacco blends were adjusted to control nicotine spikes with precision. Each design choice was tested not for safety, but for behavioral effect. When regulators attempted to measure nicotine yields using smoking machines, the industry already knew the system was flawed. Machines smoked predictably. Humans did not. Internal studies demonstrated that smokers unconsciously altered their behavior to maintain nicotine intake, a phenomenon the industry labeled compensation. This knowledge became a weapon. Cigarettes were engineered to pass regulatory tests while defeating their intent. Ventilation holes reduced machine readings but failed under real use. Tobacco blends were manipulated so nicotine delivery increased as cigarettes burned down. Smokers received higher doses later in each cigarette, reinforcing dependency. Public health officials believed they were regulating risk. They were regulating illusions. At the same time, tobacco companies launched aggressive public relations campaigns denying addiction. Executives testified before Congress under oath that nicotine was not addictive. The statements were broadcast nationwide. Behind the scenes, legal teams reviewed every word. Documents show that executives were coached to use narrow definitions of addiction that excluded behavioral dependence. The goal was not truth, but legal survivability. As evidence mounted, the industry pivoted. If addiction could no longer be denied, responsibility would be shifted. Smoking would be framed as a personal choice made with full awareness. Health warnings would be expanded, not to protect consumers, but to shield corporations from liability. The Master Settlement Agreement of 1998 marked a turning point. Tobacco companies agreed to pay billions to U.S. states and restrict certain marketing practices. In exchange, they avoided criminal prosecution. No executives were jailed. The companies survived. But the business model adapted. Nicotine manipulation did not end. It evolved. Research shifted toward alternative delivery systems and reduced harm narratives. Internal discussions explored how to maintain dependency while appearing responsive to public health concerns. Cigarettes were subtly modified to feel smoother, more efficient, and harder to quit. At the same time, global markets became the new frontier. As smoking rates declined in the United States, tobacco companies aggressively expanded into developing countries with weaker regulations. Internal documents showed strategies to replicate the same addiction engineering abroad, targeting youth, exploiting lax oversight, and opposing health warnings. Nicotine addiction became a global export. Meanwhile, scientific consensus hardened. Independent researchers confirmed what tobacco companies had known for decades. Nicotine altered brain development, particularly in adolescence. Early exposure increased the likelihood of lifelong addiction. Withdrawal symptoms mirrored those of other addictive drugs. Public trust eroded further when internal documents revealed that tobacco companies had anticipated these findings long before independent science confirmed them. They had simply chosen silence. By the early 2000s, the narrative that smoking was purely a matter of choice collapsed under the weight of evidence. Addiction was not incidental, it was engineered, sustained, protected. The question was no longer whether big tobacco had manipulated nicotine. It was how long they had known, and how deliberately they had acted. As the full scope of tobacco's internal knowledge became undeniable, governments faced a difficult reality. The evidence showed intentional manipulation of an addictive drug, systematic deception of regulators, and decades of public denial. Yet the industry remained intact. The reason was not a lack of proof, it was power. Tobacco companies had embedded themselves deeply into political systems. They were major employers, major taxpayers, and major donors. Internal correspondence revealed long-standing strategies to influence legislation, delay regulation, and frame public debate around personal responsibility rather than corporate design. When addiction could no longer be denied, the narrative shifted carefully. Smoking was acknowledged as addictive, but framed as a known risk willingly accepted by consumers. Responsibility was transferred from product design to individual behavior. This framing became central to the industry's survival. Regulation followed, but slowly and unevenly. Warning labels grew larger, advertising restrictions expanded, smoking bans spread across public spaces, yet the core mechanism of addiction remained legal and profitable. Nicotine levels were regulated only loosely. Product design remained largely protected as proprietary information. Behind the scenes, tobacco companies continued to study addiction with the same precision as before. Documents from the late 1990s and early 2000s show a renewed focus on nicotine maintenance, ensuring that smokers who attempted to quit experienced withdrawal severe enough to drive relapse. Product tweaks were introduced subtly, often justified as improvements in taste or consistency. At the same time, the industry began preparing for a future where traditional cigarettes might become politically unsustainable. Alternative nicotine products emerged. E-cigarettes, heated tobacco devices, and oral nicotine products were marketed as harm reduction tools. Publicly, they were framed as solutions. Privately, internal strategies emphasized continuity, retaining customers within the nicotine ecosystem rather than eliminating dependence. The language changed, the chemistry did not. Internal research confirmed that rapid nicotine delivery remained the key variable in sustaining addiction. Devices were optimized to replicate the same neurological spikes once delivered by cigarettes, especially among younger users with no smoking history. Once again, initiation was the priority. Marketing avoided explicit youth targeting, but product design told a different story. Sweet flavors, sleek devices, discreet usage, and high nicotine concentrations mirrored the same logic used decades earlier with cigarettes. Ease of use lowered the barrier to entry. Dependence followed quickly. Public health officials recognized the pattern. Many described modern nicotine products not as a break from tobacco history, but as its continuation. Meanwhile, tobacco companies consistently denied wrongdoing in the past. They framed document revelations as outdated practices by previous generations of leadership. Responsibility was diffused across time. Accountability dissolved. Yet the documents told a different story. They showed continuity of intent, continuity of knowledge, continuity of strategy. From early nicotine research in the 1960s to product engineering in the 1980s to alternative delivery systems in the 2000s, the objective remained unchanged. Control nicotine delivery to control behavior. Addiction was not merely tolerated, it was refined. The long-term consequences were staggering. Millions of deaths linked to smoking-related illnesses. Healthcare systems strained for decades. Families affected across generations. All while the industry's internal calculations treated addiction as a measurable, manageable variable. When historians later examined the released documents in full, a consistent theme emerged. The tobacco industry did not simply fail to warn the public. It understood addiction before regulators did. It understood neurological dependency before independent science caught up. And it chose concealment over transparency, profit over prevention. This was not negligence. It was intent. Today, the documents remain publicly accessible, millions of pages that permanently altered the historical record. They serve as evidence not only of what tobacco companies did, but of how corporate science can be weaponized when shielded from accountability. The story does not end with cigarettes. It continues wherever addiction is engineered quietly, defended legally, and denied publicly, until documents surface decades later to reveal what was known all along. And by then, the damage is already done.